So if we have a Linux machine and we want to protect it with its own firewall, we have to follow these rules. I'm going to explain you first of all this in culture, and then we're going to put it in a terminal. So first of all, we need to write the rules flush. That is these 4 rules right here. Then we set the default policy. That is this command. Now we start filtering. The first step is keeping the local host. We're gonna need it for some things, for example for MySQL connections. Then we keep everything in our IP. Here we need to write our IP. Then we permit to a colleague join to MySQL to keep the database, writing his IP. Then we permit a designer to use FTP, writing his IP. Then we need to open the 80 port because it's a web server. Then we close some important ports, and finally we check applications with this command. So now I'm gonna copy this in the terminal. Here we have to write sudo su, and we're ready to paste it. Similar as the first one, we have the flush rules here, right here. Then we have the default policy. Here we begin to filtering some commands. For example, the local host as the first exercise. Then our IP, the colleague IP, and the designer IP using the FTP. Also the 80 port, it has to be open, but the main difference here in comparison with the first exercise is this one. We need to close privileged ports, that we have these 2 commands. Also we have to close the normal port, and finally we check the applications with this command. So I'm gonna copy. Here, okay, here there is an error. We have to pay attention to these two lines. We have to put another line here. Yeah. So this third exercise, we're gonna do a LAN firewall with Ethernet output. We have the flush rules and the default policy. We have this one, and here we have access from the local network. Then we make a local network masquerade with this command. This command lets us to package forward in the firewall. Here we close the port range that we know. Then we close management port called webmin, and finally we check. So I'm gonna paste it, copy and paste it. Exercise 4 is similar to the third one, but in this one we want employees only use internet but denying access to CASA or eDonkey. So this is an effective and simple configuration. We have the flush rules, the default policy. Here we have the local host. Here we can access to the firewall with the local host, the local network, sorry. We have here the forward rule. Here we accept the transit in HTTP port. Here we accept inquiries to DNS. Then we deny the rest. Here we make a local network masquerade. Here we let us the package forward in the firewall, and here we close port range that we know with these commands, and here we close webmin that is a port, and then we check. So Here we have an error. It's right here. We need to put another line. And okay, this was UDP, so we need to copy this one, paste it, and okay, change this to add a new line. So for this exercise 5, we have a firewall. We're gonna have a firewall with SMTP, POP3, and PPTPD. So we use the commands for the rule slash the default policy. We start filtering the local host, a firewall with a local network. Here we have to pay attention here because we're gonna have access to the mail ports. Here we open the POP3. Here we have we open the PPTPD port. Here we filter with the forward rule the access to the local network. Here we accept the transit to in 80 ports. Here we accept the transit in HTTP port. Here we accept increase to DNS. We deny the rest. We make the local network masquerade. And right here we begin to close some ports. Right here we close ports, here we close the web main port, and here we close the port with the service of PPTPD, and finally we check. Okay. Now with exercise 6, we want to share some services but from server that we have within the local network. For example, the IIS of a Windows 2000 server, and also allow remote management by terminal server for this machine for an external company. In this case, what we need to be done is a port redirection. Before IPTables, this could easily be done with a server like Renet. What Renet does is simply open a port in the firewall, and when connecting to it, it takes you to the port of another machine like a pipe. With IPTables, we can make redirections with some advantage. We do not lose the source IP information, which was the case with Renet. So now let's see the configuration. Here we establish the rules flush, then we establish the default policy. Here we start filtering. Here everything that comes from the outside and goes to a port we redirect to an internal machine. Right here, the access of a determined IP to the terminal server are redirected to that machine. In this command, we need to remember that eth0 is the interface connected to the router and eth1 to the LAN. We keep the local host for things like local connections to MySQL. Right here we have access to the firewall from the local network. Right here we open access to main ports. We open port 25. We must configure the relay of the SMTP server correctly. Here we open POP3. Here we open the PPTPD port for the IP of the ADSL of the bus house. Now with forward rule, we filter the access of the local network to the outside. As explained before, forward rules are applied to packets that are not directed to the firewall itself. We accept that they go to ports 80. Right here, we accept that they go to the HTTPS ports. With these two commands, we accept that they consult the DNS. Right here, we deny the rest. If any are needed, they will notify. Right here, now we do masking to the local network and activate the forwarding bit. Right here with this, we allow forwarding of packets in the firewall. In other words, other machines can live through the firewall. With these commands, these rules, we close the unwanted accesses from the outside. Remember that this one, 0000, means any network. So we close the well-known port range. Right here, we close a management port called webmain. Here we close the PPTPD service port, and it's only open for the bus. And finally, we check the changes with this line. So I'm gonna copy and paste it in the terminal. and right here with Exercise 7, Firewall of a LAN with Internet access with DMZ. In this type of firewall, you must allow local network access to the Internet, public access to the TCP, 80 and TCP 443 port of the DMZ server, also access from the DMZ server to a LAN database, block the rest of the DMZ access to the LAN. Remember that the kind of rules that you should be used to filter traffic between the DMZ and the LAN can only be forward, since we are filtering between different networks. They are not packets destined for the firewall itself. So right here we have the flush rules, the rules flush. Here we establish the default policy. Then we start filtering. Remember that F0 is the interface connected to the router and F1 to the LAN. Everything that comes from the outside and goes to port 80, we redirect it to an internal machine. The accesses of a certain HTTPS IP are redirected to that machine. We keep the local host. Why? Because we're gonna need it in some things like local connections to MySQL. Right here, we have access to the firewall from the local network. So right here now we do masking of the local network and the DMZ so that they can go out and activate the forwarding bit. And with this we allow forwarding of packets in the firewall. That is, in other words, is that other machines can live through the firewall. Right here we allow the passage from the DMZ to a database on the LAN. With this command we allow to open the DMZ terminal server from the LAN. So you have to do it one way or the another, because then we close the DMZ access to the LAN with this. Here we close the DMZ access to the firewall itself, and in this step we close unwanted access from outside. Remember that 0000/0 means any network. So we close the well-known port range, and we close a management port called webmin, and finally we review the changes with this command. So I'm gonna copy and paste it in the terminal. And we write IPTables space line L space line N. We have here that we have this. Exercise 8, firewall between local network and internet with DMZ zone for exposed servers using public IPs. If the machines in the DMZ have a public IP, you have to be very careful not to allow forward by default. if there is a public IP in the DMZ, it's not necessary to make port redirections. It's enough to route the packet to reach the DMZ. So right here we have the rules flush. Then we have we establish default policy. Here we start filtering. Remember that F0 is the interface connected to the router and F1 to the LAN. The local host is, we keep the local host. Why? Because we're going to need it for some things such as local connections to MySQL. Right here we have access to the firewall from the local network. Then we do masking of the local network and the DMZ so that they can go out and activate the forwarding bit. With this, we allow forwarding of packets in the firewall. In other words, other machines can live through the firewall. Then we allow access from outside to DMZ ports 80 and 443. Right here we allow the passage from the DMZ to a database on the LAN. In this command, in the other sense, the same. We allow to open the DMZ terminal server from the LAN. And you have to do it one way or another, because then we close the DMZ access to the LAN. Here we close the DMZ access to the firewall itself, and now we start to close unwanted access from outside. Remember that 0000/0 means any network. We close the well-known port range, that is right here, with these two commands, and then we close a management port called webman, and finally we review the changes with this command. So I'm gonna copy and paste it in the terminal. Okay, and we write IPTables. Exercise 9, hardware firewall between networks. In this case, we forget about local networks and NAT. Here we will only have input and forward filter rules. In the firewall, we must indicate a series of rules to protect the computers that are on the other side of this device. All of them from the 211.34.149.0/24 network. Each one of them provides a specific service and can be managed from different IPs, which means that it would be necessary to give access to certain management ports, such as port 22, port 1389, etc. So here we have the rules flash, and we establish default policy. Here we start filtering. Remember that F0 is the interface connected to the router, and F0 is the interface connected to the router, and F1 to the LAN. We have full access to our firewall from our IP. Then for the rest, there is no access to the firewall. Now we can enter the rules for each server, as they will be packages destined for other machines. Forward is applied, web server 211.34.149.2, and we're gonna have access to port 80. Right here is the access to our IP to manage it. Then the rest we close it. Then we have the mail server with this number, and access to the port 25, 110 and 143. Here we have access to SMMP management, then access to our IP to manage it. The rest close it. Then the IRC server with this number, we have access to IRC ports and access to our IP to manage it. The rest we close it. Right now the new server with this number, and we have access to the news port. Now we have access to our IP to manage it, and we close it. Now the B2B server with this number, we have access to the port 443. Here we have access to an IP to manage it, and we close it. Right here the Citrix server with this direction, and we have access to port 1494 and access to an IP to manage it. Right here, access to another port, perhaps from database with TCP. Here the difference with this and this is that this is TCP and the other one is UDP. We close it, and finally we check. So I'm gonna copy and paste this script. Paste it. Okay, and IPTables, the terminal shows this. Exercise 10, Firewall with default drop policy. In the example of the DMZ, this situation was already presented in the forward rules from one network to another. To illustrate the default drop, we're going to show the configuration of the previous example of a firewall between networks, but with a default drop policy. First of all, we have the rules flash right here, and we establish the default policy drop. Then we start filtering. Remember that F0 is the interface connected to the router and F1 to the LAN. We have full access to our firewall from our IP. For the rest, there is no access to the firewall. In principle, it is more, but if we lower the permits temporarily, it covers our backs. Right here, now we can enter the rules for each server, as they will be packages designed for other machines. Forward is applied. We have the web server with this direction, and we have access to port 80. Right here we access to our IP to manage it. This command is access to the port 27, 110 and 143, and also is a mail server with this direction. Then we have access to CNMP management, then access to our IP to manage it, then the IRC server and the access to IRC ports. Access to our IP to manage it. Here we have the news server with this direction, and also the access to the ports of news server, and the access to our IP to manage it. Then the rest we close it, and now we have the server B2B in this direction, and we have access to port 443. We have access to an IP to manage it. Then we have the Citrix server with this direction, and access to the port 1494, and an IP to manage it, access to an IP to manage it. And finally we have access to another database port, perhaps here we have the TCP, the access of TCP, and right here it's very similar, but the difference is that it is UDP, and the before we have the TCP. And finally we check. So now I'm gonna copy and paste the script in the terminal. Okay, and we write IPTables, IPTables exercise 11. So with the previous script, a wall has been built between the internet and the set of servers behind the firewall. You cannot ping machines unless you have given full access to an IP. If we want to give access to ping, we would put this configuration. First of all, we have the rules flash. Then we establish the default policy. Then we start filtering. The local host we keep the local host because we're gonna need it, for example, in local connections to MySQL. Then we leave everything to our IP. Right here we let a colleague enter to MySQL to keep the database. Right here we let a designer use the FTP. Also the port 80 of www must be open because it's a web server. And right here we have here are the closing rules. As we have commented in the previous configuration, it is convenient to have this grid in case the firewall relaxes at some point and changes from drop to accept by default. We close range of privileged ports. Remember to be careful with these types of barriers. First you have to open those who do have access. Then we close another ports that are open, and finally we check the changes. So I'm gonna copy and paste it in the terminal. Okay, and we write IPTables L